I'm sorry, but you say that you believe in self-determination and that this lovely idea of let everybody decide for themselves. Yet, in Vietnam, in 1954, you refused to sign the Geneva Convention. You refused to allow independent elections in Vietnam. You forced the Diem regime onto the Vietnamese people. It was hated by the Vietnamese people. It put 6 million in forced prison camps. This was your puppet regime, and you supported it. You've refused to come to the negotiations with the Viet Cong, showing that every time you ask for a peace talk, all you do is escalate the war. This is only one example of Vietnam. You've got the example of the CIA overthrowing the Jagan government. You've got the example of it giving £104 million military aid to Greece. There are so many examples of America refusing to allow a people to determine for itself what government it would have.
Now, are you talking about a people determining what government they'll have, or are you talking about a faction within a country that wants to take over and dictate the system to a country? Now, I disagree.
About the Diem regime. Would you say that the Diem regime was a popular one, or was it one which you imposed on a people and which the people then rebelled against?
I doubt that we could make much of a case. I challenge your history. In 1954...
What is the history of the Diem regime, sir?
I do, because there was a referendum taken in 1954 in which 90% of the people voted in a referendum for Diem to take the position that he took. He was subsequently endorsed in 2 other elections, a few years in which they elected both a General Assembly for his government that was preponderantly pro-Diem. They re-elected him to his position. We could hardly have installed a puppet regime at a time when we had less than 700 unarmed military advisors, many of them non-commissioned officers, helping to teach the South Vietnamese how to organize an army for protection against guerrillas in their own country.
Are you saying that you approve of the activities of the Diem regime?
What activities?
You approve that they put 6 million in forced prison camps and that the American advisors did nothing but help them in this?
I challenge your history again. There is absolutely no record that 6 million people were put in concentration camps. They only have 16 million to begin with. Now, I'd also like to challenge something else about the supposed evils of the Diem regime. I do approve of Diem's land reform, in which he took from the great Mandarin holdings and began to make land available to the peasants and to the people of Vietnam who had never owned. But also, I would like to call to your attention that a team from the United Nations was sent to Saigon, to Vietnam, to investigate the charges made against the Diem regime. They did investigate those, but as they returned to this country, Diem was assassinated, which I think was one of the great tragedies of this whole conflict. And the United Nations report, which they declined to make official because they thought, why bring anything up now that he's been killed, has, on the other hand, been published. There has been public access to it, and the United Nations report completely cleared the Diem regime of any of the charges that had been brought against it.
Governor, let's get Senator Kennedy in on this. We haven't heard on him for a while. What about your answer to Jordan's question, Senator?
Well, why doesn't somebody ask me a question and then I'll answer it specifically?
All right.
Well, can I ask you the question then?
Hands sprout up again. Go ahead, Jordan.
Self-determination principle of which Mr. Reagan made use seems to me to be violated by America's record, by its refusal to allow free elections, which was the suggestion of the Geneva Convention, by its supporting of...
Okay, well, I understand now. I understand. I would say that there are, as I've said before, I think that there were mistakes that were made over the period of the last 10 years. There were mistakes in which I was involved. Excuse me?
Sorry, do you regard it as a mistake that 1 million civilians have been killed?
If there are 1 million civilians have been killed, I would regard it as a mistake. I think that the civilians being killed in North Vietnam or South Vietnam, I think the terrorism that existed in North Vietnam was a mistake. I think the terrorism and the killings that took place in Hungary during the 1950s were a mistake, and I think that some of the actions of President Diem in South Vietnam were a mistake. I think that the United States at various times been associated with governments which do not represent the will and the wish of the people, and I think that is most unfortunate. But I don't go on this program, and I don't think Governor Reagan goes on the program with saying that we've never made a mistake and that we've never erred, because I think that we have. But if we look at the present time, if I might say to you, if we look at the present time, the fact is the United States to have elections in South Vietnam, are willing to abide by the result of those elections, are willing to permit an outside group to come in and supervise the elections, and it's the North Vietnamese that are unwilling to accept that. Let me also say, if you want to criticize President Diem, I think that at the same time, I would suggest that perhaps you could also criticize North Vietnam. When did they last have a free election? When did they last have a free election in any of the countries who are adversaries? Now, I agree that our standard that we hold up to the rest of the world might be higher and might be different, and therefore we have a greater responsibility to adhere to it. And at times we have not. In our relationships with some of the countries of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And I'd be glad to go into what I think the explanation of that is. But I don't say that we are without fault. I don't say that even the administration that I was involved with, President Kennedy, was without fault in our policy toward Vietnam, but nor has North Vietnam. And the other important point is, which I think that you should accept and have to accept, is the fact that we are willing at the present time to abide by elections. We've stated it quite clearly, and then we're permitting the group to come in and supervise it.
Can I just make one thing, sir? I don't know who you mean by we, but President Johnson and certainly Governor Reagan isn't prepared to have realistic negotiations with the Viet Cong, who you agree ought to be at the conference table, while they're spending $20 billion a year destroying the country, and while your government and your party refuses.
You're wrong, your figures again. It's about $25 billion.
Oh, well, splendid. $25 billion.
But I wouldn't say that, let me just say this. This doesn't do any good for any of us to get an exaggeration. We're not spending $25 billion to destroy the country. We feel very strongly in the United States, and you can smile if you wish, but except we listen to you, just listen to us for a second. We want the people of South Vietnam. Again, Governor Reagan and I have some differences, and I have perhaps differences with others, but the fact is that we do agree that we will abide by the results of elections in South Vietnam. That's all we're interested in South Vietnam. The people will make their own determination. President Johnson has said publicly by the elections that even if the communists take over the country, that the United States will withdraw. Now, if the North Vietnamese, which should make a public statement now, will abide by the elections, and we'll have elections there in 60 days, and we'll have the ICC come in and supervise the elections, then I think that, and we then back down, then I think there's more point to your statement. Right? But we've held out the challenge that we're willing to abide by the elections. If that's where you put your emphasis. I think it's much more complicated.
If this doesn't happen in 60 days, can we take it that I'm right?
Excuse me?
You said, sir, that if this doesn't happen in 60 days, there's a point to my question.
No, but if the North Vietnamese, will the North Vietnamese agree to elections? Can you deliver the North Vietnamese?
Senator Kennedy, can I ask you something about these elections? Because what I understand from reading the American press is that in the elections that have recently been held in South Vietnam, no one that the government considered in its own opinion was either a neutralist or a communist was allowed to stand.
Yes, that's right.
There was also considerable intimidation. Now, it seems to me that if you accuse us of being inconsistent, if you're going to accuse North Vietnam of not holding, you should condemn the South Vietnam government that President Johnson is supporting for holding elections that are equally as farcical as anything that ever happened in any communist country.
Let me just say this. I said at the beginning that there were mistakes and things done that I would disagree with in South Vietnam. I'm just saying, and I don't think, and I agree with your criticism of the elections of South Vietnam, as I have said before. I don't think that's the point. The point is that we have said that we'd be willing to abide by the result of the elections. And I don't say that the elections that have been held have been free elections. You're absolutely right. The government of South Vietnam has not permitted neutralists or communists or people from the National Liberation Front to participate in the elections that have held in the past. But we have said the United States policy has been that if the North Vietnamese will agree to it, the National Liberation Front will agree to it, that we will agree to hold elections in which all parties will participate.